One of the biggest secrets of elite universities is that bias runs rife. Now, I have seen bias take many forms. It can be that they believe that students from a certain country act a certain way. It can be that they favor students from their home country. The biases, the stereotypes that exist seem to be amplified at the higher ends of academic success. Now, what I mean about that is, when I was speaking to different supervisors, there would be some different kind of concept, right or wrong, almost certainly wrong a lot of the time, about certain nationalities. For example, Indian students are lazy. Chinese students will work themselves almost to death. And I remember hearing a supervisor say to another supervisor, well, we should get ourselves a couple of Chinese students so that we can really run them to death in the lab. And I was like, that is just insane to me that these sort of comments are allowed to take place in a modern academic world. And unfortunately, you'll see why they're able to get away with that later on in this video. But other sorts of biases exist. I have seen supervisors not employ women because they're worried that as soon as they get a job, a stable position, some money, they're going to get pregnant and leave. And so I have actually heard a supervisor of mine say, well, we shouldn't get a woman because they'll just end up having a baby and sort of like mucking up our research progress. For some reason in academia, these people feel comfortable saying these things. So there we are. Bias and stereotypes are just allowed in academia, and people really lean into them, which is a horrible, dirty secret to start with. Here are loads more that you need to know about. By the way, a little disclaimer, all of the things I'm going to talk about are actually prevalent in nearly every academic institution I've ever worked at, that I've heard stories at, and that I've talked to people from different, institutions, from Oxford all the way down to wherever I was. And unfortunately, the thing is that as you get higher up the academic status ladder, as a university or a PhD program becomes more elite, the things get amplified. And here they are. They are almost certainly always at their worst in these elite programs. And it's horrible to say these things, but it's something you should really know. The more elite a university is, the more it is run like a super hardcore business. The outcomes of their research will be turned into intellectual property, they will be turned into patents, and they will be turned into spin-off companies. Now, the thing about this is that not all academics are actually trained in how to start a company. And so there's a lot more kind of feelers coming in from the outside about industry engagement, about creating spin-off companies, and that can put a whole different pressure on your PhD research, because your university supervisor is not just worried about the academic outcomes of their work anymore. They are more worried about how they generate money. And of course, generating money can come from grants. Every academic does that. But in higher elite institutions, I certainly feel like there is a huge pressure to turn their work into really valuable outcomes for industry, and that is where the different spin-off companies sort of come from. And as a PhD student, you may feel a little left out if all of a sudden, your supervisor's spinning out this certain company and you're kind of just alone in the lab being like, well, what do I do now? And there's another little issue that we'll talk about a little bit later. But ultimately, the more elite a university is, the more reputation they have, and therefore the more pressure there is for them to create intellectual property that the university can make money on. The pressures just come from everywhere, don't they? In nearly every university, professors have almost sort of like godlike presence in their research group. But at elite universities, this is taken to an absolute extreme. The university wants these professors in their lab. These are professors that have likely been nominated for Nobel Prizes, got Nobel Prizes, achieved the highest kind of awards in their field. And so the university will do anything to keep them, which means the supervisor, if they are this way inclined, will become the ultimate kind of tyrant of your lab. They will make you stay there for 7 days a week in the lab, 12 hours plus a day. They will make sure that you know that they are the boss, and they can get away with it. They can get away with sexist marks, they can get away with racist comments, they can get away with almost anything because they are so valuable to the university that the university will protect them at nearly all costs. I've seen a situation here in Adelaide where a supervisor was caught actively bullying, actively lying on grant applications, doing Photoshop changes to their results and then presenting that as fact to get grants. And it took so long for the university to get rid of them because they were just bringing in loads of money, and the university was like, well, if we get rid of them, we're going to miss out on money. So let's just sort of like try to sort this out before we fire him. They ended up firing the guy. But it took far too long considering the evidence that they had against him. And that's only worse in the higher up universities, I can guarantee you. Universities are slowly catching up to this, but a lot of elite universities have zero career advice and progression services for you after you finish your PhD. And I've talked about this in my other videos where I've just sort of like said the reason people feel depressed, go check out this one here, is just because they are kicked out the other end, and it's like, all right, you've got your PhD, thanks for doing all that work for us, oh, we don't have any money for you, see ya. And that's about it. Lower universities are certainly understanding that they can no longer do that because universities don't create positions or courses, based on the number of positions available. They're not like a supply and demand sort of thing. The problem is that there's zero career support because they're not worried about you after your degree or your PhD. They're just worried about what you can deliver right now. And so, there is also almost certainly no career support, and that's completely up to you to think about before you even start your PhD, let alone at an elite university. Start thinking about what you want to do if you don't become an academic as soon as you enter that PhD program, and start building those skills to allow you to transition, because the universities almost certainly won't help you do that. The higher up the university rankings you go, the more connections and relationships matter rather than your hard work. Now, what I mean about that is you've heard about networking, you've heard about sort of like these networking activities, these collaborations in academia. Ultimately, if you can get yourself an awesome collaborator in university, you are seen as super valuable. That's why universities like to hire people from Oxford, Cambridge, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, all of those places, MIT, because they have got a load of connections that the university can leverage, and it also just means that they've got connections to people that are more likely to be sort of publishing in higher impact journals, increasing the kind of reputation of the university and the research in general that they're doing and the department that they're in. All of that all matters not on really their work. It matters because they have the connections. Now, I did a video about politics in academia. Go check it out here or here. I forget which way it goes. But ultimately, in elite universities, that is on steroids. It is politics beyond politics. Essentially, you've got the top of the top professors as sort of like deemed by their awards, their prestige, their outputs in really high impact factor journals. You know, there may be some Nobel Prize winners. And that means that the politics at the very top slither of this field is going to be very toxic. They're going to be jostling for who's the best of the best of the best of the best. And that means who gets the most money, who's got the most kind of students, who's got the most lab space. They really, really care about all of those little tiny political movements, which means that it is just, or it can be, a very difficult place to actually get any work done because everyone's just worried about making sure that they are on top. And if your supervisor is like that, then it is a very, very tough sort of environment in which to be doing your PhD. At elite universities, hyper-competitiveness is at its all-time high. I've heard some tragic stories. For example, I've heard people having to lock away their lab books at night because other students in the lab will come and rip out pages, will rip off their ideas and present them to the research leader as their own. That is only one of a whole sort of like universe of horrible competitive stories that I've heard about. And you know what? If you were to say that person stole my ideas ideas, they'd be like, well, you know, whoever's idea came to me first, that's who owns it. You know, that's the sort of environment we're talking about. It's hyper competitive, it's incredibly political, and it will go to the point of people will start sabotaging the other people in the lab that they're meant to be working alongside of. And I've told this story in the past in another video, is I've heard of a professor putting on 2 students on one project and saying to them, whoever gets me the result first, whoever gets this certain sort of like milestone first, gets a PhD, and the other one gets kicked out. Now, I would not agree to that. You would not see me in that situation at all. But of course, in these hyper sort of elite academic institutions, they can do that because they are God. No one's going to say, oh no, I don't want to get a PhD from wherever this is, you know, this crazy awesome university, because yeah, it was too competitive. That's just not the way the system is sort of like designed. And so they can get away with terrible crap like that. In elite PhD programs, mental health issues are far more common. They are deeper, and also, arguably, you are less likely to seek help because, you know, the narrative around it is, well, you couldn't hack it, you couldn't put up with the pressure, when in fact, there should be ultimate support for these students that doesn't exist at the moment in many universities. And, you know, the moment you complain is the moment that you're deemed as weak or not capable of doing it. And that is, you know, a kind of internalized narrative that we tell ourselves. And unfortunately, the higher the institution in the academic ladder, the more sort of mental health issues there are. And also, they're not even allowed to kind of like talk about them. So mental health issues get worse as the program gets more elite. The last thing I want to say is that in elite PhD programs, you'll almost certainly be working under an advisor who is very, very busy. Your supervisor will be doing international talks and tours and be away, and they'll also have so many PhD students and graduate students and researchers and postdocs that you will almost certainly not see them almost at all. There is this thing called ghost advising, where you are sort of like, you know, nominally underneath this really awesome professor, but really you're supervised by the PhD postdocs or the senior PhD students. Now, the thing about this is that, yeah, that's, you know, partly because they're super busy and they're well known, and so they're getting, you know, invitations to go speak at events and conferences, but also just because they just don't need to. You know, they're bringing in the grant money, they're bringing in the industry money, they're bringing in the intellectual property money, they've got their spin-off companies, they're super busy, and you're just part of the cog in their successful machine, which means that it can be very hard to keep yourself motivated, accountable, moving forward, and also it can just mean that, you know, you just don't really get any support from the number one person you should be getting the support from, which is the supervisor. So that sounds a bit rubbish, doesn't it? So there we have it. There are the dirty secrets of elite PhD programs. They are almost certainly seen in every other PhD program, but in elite programs, they are like on steroids. They are just boosted to the max. Let me know in the comments the stories you've heard. Have you got any first-hand experience of any of the issues in this video or anything else? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear. I read every comment, and it's just so great to see you all helping each other sort of like just survive academia in general. It's exactly what I wanted this channel to be. And also go check out academiainsider.com. That's where I've got my ebooks, the Ultimate Academic Writing Toolkit, as well as the PhD Survival Guide. I've also started a blog there as well, with loads more useful and awesome information about making your PhD work for you. And I'll see you in the next video.